The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents, You Shouldn't Use That Word. This video is going to be a little unusual for me. I'm not doing a debate. I'm not reviewing a debate. I'm not talking about a particular apologetic. I am talking about magical thinking, offense, and profanity. Which means I guess I should give a warning at the outset. I will be using words that some people object to and talking about whether or not they should and what it means with respect to the debates. And you might be thinking, hang on, if he's going to talk about offense and profanity, what the hell does that have to do with the Atheist Debates project? We'll get to that, I promise. So whether you refer to them as obscene, profane, harsh, impolite, naughty, dirty, filthy, swearing, cursing, cussing, not suitable for work, offensive, we're going to talk a little bit about language and words that people say you shouldn't say, like fuck, which is actually probably one of my favorite words that ends up in the you can't say this bag. First of all, we've talked before about language, about words. Words are tools used to convey concepts between individuals that share some understanding of the usage of that word. They don't have intrinsic meaning. Words have uses. The tool is only as effective as the commonality of understanding between the individuals who are using that tool. There's nothing about a word that is intrinsically offensive. As a matter of fact, one of my first real objections on this front came when I discovered the Supreme Court ruling that kind of determined that there were fighting words, that there were words that were, by their very nature, so offensive that people's natural response was to engage in violence in response to those words. I wholeheartedly reject the fighting words doctrine, that there's anything at all, any word that you could say to someone that would justify physical violence in response. This actually came up a little bit in a debate that I did with Seitan Bruggencate, where at one point he tried to make the case that if he called my wife a whore, it would be reasonable. He would reasonably expect that I might punch him or want to punch him. And I pointed out, no, that's not the case. I don't know, you can consider it arrogant, but I'm so above that, it's just ridiculous. Because, first of all, either my wife is a whore or she's not. If she is, then you're stating something that's accurate, and it would be irrational for me to get upset about you stating the truth. If she's not, then you're stating something that's inaccurate, and that tells us far more about you and how reasonable you are and what sort of conclusions you reach, and doesn't really impact my thoughts about my wife and shouldn't impact anybody else's thoughts about my wife. Also, you're using whore as a pejorative, and I have no problem with whoredom. I'm in favor of the legalization of prostitution. I don't think we should be using that as a pejorative. I think it should be legal and regulated, etc. So I don't find it offensive. I do, though, understand why other people might find it offensive, but I just don't think that there's any way that you can justify a violent response to this. Now, this entire video was prompted by a discussion with some atheists. A couple weeks ago, there was a truck cited near San Antonio. And on the back of the truck on the window, it said, fuck Trump and fuck you if you voted for Trump. This prompted the sheriff to put out a call to say, hey, you should contact us. Maybe we can talk about this. And the ACLU jumped in to basically say, hey, there's nothing to talk about. It's free speech. So if the sheriff comes after you, get a hold of us because you're allowed to say this. And there were one or two atheists on my friends list when I posted this who were like, well, you know, yes, I agree with the sentiment, fuck Trump, but I don't think it's the sort of thing that people should, be putting on their cars. Okay, then you're a hypocrite. You completely agree with the sentiment, but you're objecting to somebody exercising their free speech to make that sentiment. What are the grounds for this? What are you objecting to? Well, we'll get to the primary objection a little later, but the first notion is that this is offensive. This is the sort of language that is somehow impolite and shouldn't be used. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, I don't care. That doesn't mean that I don't care that someone is offended. I care whether or not there's a justification for that offense. Because the dirty little secret is that somebody's going to be offended almost no matter what. When I walk into a church to do a debate against a Christian apologist, there are members of that church who are already offended that I'm invited to speak in their church. They may actually have a good reason for that. This is the place where we come to hear about Jesus. We shouldn't be allowing people to come in here to talk trash about Jesus. That offense may actually be more justified than anybody being upset over fuck Trump on a vehicle. But the thing is, they're offended that I'm being invited to speak. They are going to be offended, some of them, that I don't believe what they believe. They're going to be offended that I don't sit quietly and refuse to share my disbelief. They're offended that I'm so vocal about it. They're going to be offended when I point out that their Bible supports immorality. They're going to be offended when I point out that their beliefs are unfounded, that they aren't able to give rational justifications for them. All of those things are going to offend them. And that really doesn't bother me. Their offense is not sufficient to warrant me not doing those things. Because the important thing is the justification for that offense. When I talk about the justification for offense, I want somebody to give me a reason why this particular word, this usage, is sufficiently problematic that we should discourage its use generally. That it's such a massive distraction, that it is not in any way a valid or reasonable part of a conversation. And I think that there are words that fall into that category. But it's because those words have so much baggage and have so much impact and have no redeeming qualities, essentially. When I ask somebody, why are you offended by fuck? Their own magical thinking betrays them, because you'll find them using substitutes, fudge. Well, when somebody says fuck Trump, they're not suggesting that we have sex with Trump. So while we could say, hey, let's have sex, let's make love, let's do it, let's make whoopee, none of those things are going to get censored. But if you say let's fuck and you're intending to say the same thing as make love, have sex, whoopee, etc., the fuck one will get censored. Why? It's expressing the same concept even though you're talking about the same thing. And when we outlaw those words, when we censor those words, all we're doing is being pretentious douches. He said, let's make whoopee, let's do it. Because, we didn't want to say the thing that was offensive, even though we all know. We're all talking about everybody, almost everybody. There are asexuals and people who don't like to have sex, but almost everybody likes sex. It's the foundation of who we are as a species. But when somebody says fuck Trump, they're not talking about sex at all. They're now just using this expletive, which almost has no real meaning. It may derive from, sort of forced sex things or whatever, or screw him, but nobody's actually talking about sex. Instead, what they're doing is expressing a sentiment that I'm opposed to them. I don't like this person. I don't like their policies, or you have pissed me off or irritated or offended me or whatever. So we clearly aren't talking about sex, and now we just have a word here. What's it mean? What's the concept that it's delivering? Now, I have a friend who for years would use the N-word. And when we called him out on it, he'd say, hey, I don't mean this in any racist way. This is just a word that I use for pieces of shit everywhere. And I can't tell you how many frustrating conversations I had over that, because there's an offense that is almost certainly justified, that the word doesn't have redeeming qualities in its normal usage. It's used as a bullying, degrading term, and his own description of his usage is still a bullying, degrading term. He just has decided in his mind he can decouple race from it. Now, language is ours to play with. We are the masters of language, and we could totally do that with whatever word we wanted to. The problem is, if he walks out in public and uses that word, how many people are going to hear that and have no idea of his special esoteric context? probably most of them. And this is where we sidestep away from offense and consider when we should say which words and when we shouldn't. This is where we get into how is this relevant to the Atheist Debates Project, discussions about God, etc. So once upon a time, there was a call on the atheist experience, and the caller felt that this conversation was very important. She believed in God, we didn't. This was an important conversation that we needed to have. There needed to be agreement. We needed to recognize that we were going to die in our sin and go to hell and all this other stuff. And we had a conversation with her where we exposed flaws in her thinking, where we got her to a point where she was essentially trapped. She had no other responses. And this was the point where she just said, well, you know, I believe what I believe and you believe what you believe, and, you know, no big deal. And she had spent so much time expressing how important this was at the beginning that this dishonest turn at the end was rather frustrating. And so I said, then why the fuck did you call? Oh, how dare you use that sort of language. Oh my goodness. And there were atheists who said, see, this is why you don't do this. You shouldn't use this kind of language, because now she has an excuse to disregard everything you've said because you used a word that she finds offensive. Well, you're right and you're wrong. She does have an excuse. She can make up whatever excuse she wants. Had that call not finished with me uttering an expletive, her excuse might have been, well, that individual is just, God's given them over to a reprobate heart, or they've hardened their heart to Jesus, or they're closed-minded, or whatever excuse they needed to make it so they didn't have to acknowledge that they had run out of any reasonable grounds on which to justify their position, that they had been exposed at every opportunity, but they wanted to keep their belief. They're going to find that rationalization anyway. And if they disregard the substance of the conversation because of one word that they didn't like at the end, which has no bearing on which one of us is right, then that is something else that you can expose. This is not, you know, I could have ended that call and not done that, but I'm not at all regretful that I ended it that way. Dismissing the substance for the style allows me to make an additional point and to make it to other people, to allow them to see, look at how dishonest this individual was. They called because this was important, and when they found out that they couldn't argue their case and were faced with the possibility of having to change their mind, they said, well, you know, it's not really all that important. You believe what you believe, I believe what I believe. And when I said, why the fuck did you call? They used that as a way to dismiss the content. So I still get to make the point either way. This done at universities, at churches, wherever we've done them. I'm not sure, but there may not be a formal debate in which I've ever said fuck. I won't say I've never used any sort of profanity in any debate, because I know that I'm of the mind that there are times and places where that is useful and effective and proper, including in formal debates, but I don't use it. Why not? Well, it's not because I'm a hypocrite. It's not because I have any sort of magical thinking about these words, these phonemes, this collection of letters having some magical ability to offend. I recognize that the offense is taken, that if my substance is disregarded because they don't like a word, that's their problem and it's something else that I can expose. However, you have a responsibility, if you're speaking publicly, to consider your audience and your goals, and to come up with ways that are most effective at reaching those goals. If I know that my mom doesn't like certain words that she considers profane, which, by the way, that particular label comes from the religious aspect. This is profane. It is against the divine, essentially. Obscene are things that are, usually scatological and sexual, that we shouldn't, filthy, naughty, dirty, blah, blah, blah. But if I know my mom is going to react negatively to those, then it may be in my best interest to not use those words when I'm having a conversation with her, if I want her to pay attention. On the other hand, if we've reached a point in a conversation where it's clear the other person's just waiting for their turn to talk, or you're going to talk for another 30 seconds, but they've already made up your mind about what to say, that everything you're saying right now is going to be ignored and dismissed because they've already found a point that they want to attack, then using a impolite word may actually be the most effective thing you can do. If we're having a conversation, if you start raising your voice and yelling, that could be just as problematic or more problematic than a word somebody objects to. But if I say, your Bible is fucking immoral and advocates for slavery and rape, the use of the word fuck is a shock element that gets them to focus for a second. Holy crap, what did I just hear? Did he dare to go to the why would he do that? Why would he do that? And now if they're more offended that you use that word than that they are advocating for a book that sanctions slavery and rape, now you have a whole other point to talk about. This gets back to Tim Minchin's beautiful Pope song. It's the very point of the Pope song. Go to YouTube, look up Pope song if you haven't heard it, by Tim Minchin, M-I-N-C-H-I-N. It's brilliant. There is a time and a place for this. Also, I'd recommend looking up a short clip from Stephen Fry on swearing, because Stephen makes a point eloquently and far more succinctly than I'm going to be able to. So there may be a time that you might want to use it. But I have to consider my audience, and I have to consider what's going to be effective. There may be other better ways to shock people. There may be other better ways to get them to pay attention. There may be different ways to phrase things so that it reaches more people. It's an experimentation process. My objection here, which is what got all this started, is when you tell people you shouldn't use that word. That's fundamentally different from I'm not going to use that word, or I think that I have a case for why this word is counterproductive in the situation you're using it. When you just say you shouldn't use that word, you're engaged in magical thinking and you're giving the words a power to offend or harm. And I've asked over and over again, what justification do you have for what's your objection? You know, you're using euphemisms. Shouldn't this be about the meaning of the words? You're making this particular English phoneme and collection of letters out to be taboo when somebody's just going to replace it with somebody else in order to convey the exact same meaning. Bite me. Is that offensive? I mean, if it expresses the same sentiment as fuck you, I don't know why it would be considered any different. There's something about these words that people have attributed magical qualities to. So what's the answer? Why were so many people offended that this truck said this? It's really easy. What about the children? There are probably children out there who saw that on the truck, and there are probably parents of children out there who don't want their kid to see that or know that word or know anything about that. So let's address that. Not to put too fine a point on it, but that's a fucking asinine reason to object. First of all, if your kids can read and read that sign on the back of the truck, the odds are good they're already from it, rather than have a conversation with them about it. You might be shirking your responsibilities as a parent. When we teach kids that words are bad and shouldn't be uttered, we're encouraging magical thinking. We're encouraging the idea that offense is given, not taken. We're encouraging the idea that there are some things you just shouldn't do. It's sort of we're not just conforming, but conforming to bad reasons for things. Wouldn't it be better if we explain to kids how words are used and how they're perceived by different people? If you explain to your kid that it's not the words that are bad, but the concepts and ideas behind them. When a word is used to bully and malign and marginalize people, when the concept that it's advocating is morally repugnant, it is the concept that we object to and not just the word. Wouldn't it be better to explain to kids that here are some words that people really don't want you to say in polite company? They don't have a good reason for this. But until you can actually change their mind, it may be in your best interest to not use those words to them if your goal is to communicate with them and to reach them. There are people who will shut down merely because you use this word. There are people who will look at you as if you are intellectually inferior or weak-minded just because you use this word. Those people are wrong, but it is not likely that you're going to convince them that they're wrong merely by using the word on its own. You may have to have this secondary conversation. I don't talk to kids like they're kids. I don't engage in the baby talk. I don't talk down to them. I don't try to dumb things down. I treat kids like they're people, even if they're not. It's one of my favorite jokes coming from Bill Hicks is, "You're a person when you're in my phone book." But when I was growing up, we had this thing, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." We've lost sight of that. It's not perfect. You may actually be telling your bully that they're just not going to get to you with words, so they better go get a stick, and that might not be the best advice. But the sentiment behind that is something that I do value. I recognize that the way people perceive words can harm them, but only if they allow it. That debate that I talked about where Cy suggested that I would be offended or bothered by him claiming that my wife was a whore, that really does kind of sum up my take on this. It's very difficult to offend me, maybe impossible to offend me with a mere word. But you can offend my sensibilities, my sense of decency, by advocating for concepts that are immoral, that are hurtful. It's not the words the bully uses that are the problem. It's the bullying that is the problem. It's not the words that someone uses that are bad. It is the concept behind them that may be bad. When we wash kids' mouths out with soap, well, that to me is potentially on par with spanking, but that's a time for a discussion for another time. But we're reinforcing this idea that something has come out of their mouth that is so terrible that they should never say it again in polite company, that they should never express that sentiment again. I'd recommend exercising some caution there and make sure that what you're addressing is the sentiment of what they're saying and not the words they chose to say. Because if your kid says, "Man, that fucking sucks," he's not expressing something, or she's not expressing something that is bad or offensive. They're just expressing their frustration. It's a word like any, it's not doing any harm to anybody. They're not advocating, they're not talking about sex, they're not doing anything that is obscene, immoral, offensive, or anything else. And when you, as a parent, and I'm not a parent, so you can completely ignore me, and you are free to raise your kids however you want. I'm not here to tell you what the right way to raise your kids is. I'm telling you what I think about this particular situation. Encourage kids to think of words as if the words are the problem. How is that fundamentally different from teaching them any other flawed idea? They're going to grow up to reinforce these ideas that we should be scared of words, that the words can hurt, or that it's unavoidable that the words hurt. I know people who are seriously wounded by comments from people. It's difficult. There are people who say, "Oh, Matt, you're bald, you're fat, whatever." I don't know that has ever actually bothered me that much, because it was true. Hey, I'm bald, I'm fat. Tell me something that I don't know. I don't know why you're using either of those as an insult. Is there something, you're portraying that there's something wrong here? If we raise kids to think that words can be bad without consideration of the sentiment behind them, I think we've made a mistake. And I think the solution is to teach them about the concepts behind the words that are the real problem, and how when we make exceptions for certain words. When we say this is something that nobody should say, it's because there's no redeeming value there. There's no real benefit there. And I don't know if that applies to any word ever, but it probably might. But when someone expresses a sentiment that you agree with and you disagree with how they chose to say it, is it really more objectionable that they used fuck or that they used poor grammar, that they misspelled a word? Is there really much difference in that? I don't think so. Someone called me a hypocrite because I said, hey, I don't say fuck around my mom. It's not because I think the word's magical in its power to offend. It's because I suspect that she does. And if my goal is to maintain the peace around my mom, that's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make. I'm not just a contrarian, but the second somebody tells me that I can't or shouldn't say something without a good reason, I'm likely to say it. And if my mom tells me that I'm not allowed to say fuck around her, I'll say fuck that.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.